Hey everybody, this is Chapter 1 of Castoriadis and Critical Theory by Christos Memos. The chapter is titled Origins, Early Years in Greece, Migration, and Life in France. The aim of this chapter is to illuminate Castoriadis' early stages and initial influences following his transition from Greece to France. His formative years were very significant for his future intellectual and political evolution. The ideas that he developed later were definitely related to his social environment and were inseparable from the cultural and historical process. More specifically, this chapter examines the concrete historical circumstances, the socio-political background, and the intellectual milieu in Greece and France that influenced the early Castoriadis. He went through unique experiences that formed his personality and his intellectual background. Growing up in Greece, he lived under the dictatorship of the 4th of August 1936 and the Nazi occupation of Greece in 1941. He also joined the Greek communist-Trotskyist movement. He realized from experience what Stalinism and Trotskyism meant, and he experienced the very beginning of the Greek Civil War, the armed conflict of December 1944, as well as the intervention of British imperialism. The chapter goes on to investigate the distinctiveness of Castoriadis' migration and outlines the political and intellectual context in post-war France where he experienced the developing intellectual ferment and opened himself up to other radical influences and intellectual currents. In this regard, the chapter concludes that his early years in Greece, the existentialist experience of his migration, and later on the intellectual milieu in France decisively shaped his intellectual distinctiveness and were reflected in Castoriadis' later theoretical and political trajectory. Section 1.1 Formative Years and the Historico-Political Setting in Greece. Cornelius Castoriadis was born on the 11th of March 1922 in Constantinople, Istanbul, where he grew up in Greece, as the Greek-Turkish conflict forced his father to relocate the family to Athens. Cornelius's father, Caesar, was a Francophile and an admirer of the atheist Voltaire and a rabid anti-royalist. His mother, Sophia, had a great interest in music and imparted to her son her love for the arts. She developed symptoms of schizophrenia after 1933, no doubt an unpleasant situation for young Castoriadis' emotional well-being. Both parents had a strong influence on Castoriadis' intellectual habits and cultivated his curiosity and critical thinking. Castoriadis was 13 years old when he expressed a strong interest in philosophy and began to read classical philosophical texts by himself. At the same time, the social conditions and Greek political developments fostered his involvement in political issues. During that period, Greece was marked by profound social changes and political upheavals, which were accelerated due to the military defeat by the Turks in 1922, the quote, national disaster, end quote, and the collapse of the quote, great idea. The military collapse caused a massive wave of refugees from the Near East to Greece, whose urgent need for re-establishment, integration, and welfare accelerated the land reform and led to rapid urbanization and industrialization. The rapidly increasing industrial expansion, however, was not accompanied by analogous technological advances. There was no heavy industry and working-class incomes remained extremely meager. The working conditions in the factories were awful, and the economic achievements did not entail an improvement in working-class standards of living. Greece remained an agrarian and petty bourgeois country, and its economic growth was coupled with an authoritarian parliamentary system and political instability. The dominant bourgeoisie was represented by two major political parties, the liberals, Venizelists, and the populists, anti-Venizelists. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but bear with me. Their struggles to seize political power and establish liberal political institutions was based on charismatic leadership and repressive political measures in order to preserve the bourgeois order. This period was also marked by military coups and dictatorships, among them Pangalos's 1925 to 1926 and Metaxas's 1936 to 1941 dictatorships not only led to the institutions of bourgeois democracy to collapse, but also involved mass political persecutions and established concentration camps, metaxas for leftist and communist party members. Both parliamentary and dictatorial governments, under the pretext of the threat of communism, imposed their political terrorism in order to oppress and control the Greek labor movement. Within this political context, and around the same time as the beginning of his philosophical engagement, Castoriadis started to express his political interest through the reading of the communist publications and texts by Marx that were available in Greece in the years before the outbreak of the Second World War. Philosophy and politics would constitute the two pillars upon which Castoriadis' intellectual course would be based, and they would determine the content and nature of his scholarly work. Castoriadis was attracted to Marxism due to his, quote, very strong feeling about the absurdity and injustice of the existing state of affairs, end quote. And his mode of thinking was arguably marked by the political milieu in Greece and his participation in the Greek working class and communist movement. Though fragmented and weak at its very beginning, the Greek labor movement was organized at a national level in 1918 thanks to the foundation of the Greek General Foundation of Labor. The formation of the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, and its Bolshevization in 1924 was a turning point in the course of the labor and leftist movement. Throughout the interwar period, the Greek Communist Party was prosecuted, oppressed, and from time to time outlawed. The dictatorship of 1926 signaled the beginning of a period of systematic persecutions and underground political activities for the members of the party. The, quote, Idiomnemon law, end quote, of 1929, passed by the liberals, introduced punishment for communist ideas and resulted in the imprisonment and exile of thousands of communist members and leftists. Given the fact that the labor movement gained strength during these years, e.g. mass strikes and bloody demonstrations in Thessalonica, May 1936, Metaxas' dictatorship, August 1936, dealt a devastating blow to the Greek leftist movement. Not only communist and leftist citizens, but also Republicans were arrested and exiled to islands and concentration camps. At the same time, basic bourgeois civil rights, e.g. freedom of speech, expression, association, and the press, were abolished. The role of the Communist Party at that time should be understood in a double sense. On the one hand, it reflects the international development of the communist movement, and more particularly what happened to the USSR, especially after the intervention of the Comintern and the Stalinization of the Greek Party in 1931. Due to the fact that there was no other mass radical alternatives to the bourgeois policy during this interwar period in Greece, the Communist Party capitalized on the initial achievements of the Russian Revolution. On the other side, the course of the Communist Party reflects the development of the Greek labor movement with its difficulties and contradictions. More emphatically, however, it shows the great heroism and self-sacrifices of the Greek communists, which attracted many young intellectuals who rallied around the Communist Party, among them Cornelius Castoriadis, who had joined the underground Greek communist youth in 1937. He thus first became familiar with the practice of Marxism through the political activities of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, and Stalinist Greek Communist Party. Later on, after the beginning of the Nazi occupation, Castoriadis expressed his opposition to the, quote, chauvinistic policy, end quote, of the Greek Communist Party, KKE. With some of his comrades, he endeavored to alter the policy of the Communist Party, but he very soon came to realize that this was far from being a realistic goal. Having been disillusioned, he established relationships with the Trotskyists, and more specifically, he joined the Trotskyist group of Stalinos in 1942. Stalinos was a leading member of the Greek Communist Party, but later on he espoused Trotskyism and led several Trotskyist groups that resulted from the fragmentation and numerous splits of the Trotskyist Greek movement. Despite their sectarian policy and their political marginalization, all of these minor groups kept alive a critical attitude, particularly concerning the nature of the Soviet system. Even under the hard times of lawlessness, exile, or imprisonment, the Greek Trotskyists continued a critical dialogue on, quote, Stalinism and the, quote, Russian question, end quote. In this context, Stalinos' political and theoretical thought had contributed to a large extent to Castoriadis' intellectual progress. According to Castoriadis, Stalinos was for him a, quote, model fighter, a, quote, fighter without political taboo, end quote, Having been under the influence of Trotskyism and Stalinis's ideas, Castoriadis formed the basic core of his later critique of the Soviet system. The following questions raised by Stalinis designated Castoriadis' early thinking and shaped his theoretical itinerary. Why did the Russian Revolution degenerate? Why did Lenin and Bolshevism emerge? How did they win the working class's confidence? Why did Luxemburg's critique remain a voice in the wilderness? And finally, did Marxist theory include from the very beginning some elements that rendered possible this development and allowed, quote, bureaucrats, well, that's not a quote, allowed bureaucrats and, quote, executioners, end quote, to make use of it? One can clearly see in Castoriadis' writings in France an attempt to provide a satisfactory reply to Stalinis's agonizing questions. In this climate, Castoriadis argued that the armed conflict between the National People's Liberation Army, the ELAS, and the British Army in December 1944 arose from the totalitarian and bureaucratic policy of the Greek Communist Party, which aimed at seizing absolute power. He criticized the chauvinistic policy of the Greek Communist Party, its centralism and bureaucratization, and characterized the conflict of December as the, quote, first Stalinist attempt of a coup d'etat in Greece, end quote. In this context, in early 1945, Castoriadis went on to claim that the political activities of the Greek Trotskyist group that he belonged to did not accord with Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote. Hence, Castoriadis suggested that the group had to dismiss Trotsky's analysis. Stalinis's Trotskyist group made an effort to apply Luxemburg's internationalism to the specific conditions in Greece and did not draw any distinction among Germans, British, French, Russians, and Greeks. Hence, for this policy, the Greek Trotskyists, with, of course, Castoriadis among them, were persecuted by the Germans, the Greek Stalinists, and later on by the British Army and the right-wing Greek government. In other words, Castoriadis experienced not only the fight against fascism and British imperialism, but also the fight between, quote, comrades, end quote. Since the Stalinist Greek Communist Party carried out assassinations of Greek Trotskyists and socialists, he thereby obtained a very strong taste of orthodox Marxism in practice through Stalinist ideology, the bureaucracy and dogmatism of the KKE. He also ran the risk of being arrested and murdered by the Greek Stalinists, and undoubtedly, this experience caused him obsessions or traumas, which proved to be crucial in forming the grounds of his later critique of Marxism and Marx. Section 1.2. Cultural milieu and intellectual influences. Throughout this early period in Greece, Castoriadis not only had unique practical political experience, but he obtained a very strong flavor of the vulgar, codified, and mechanistic Marxism of the Greek communist movement. The transmission of Marxist ideas was undoubtedly linked with the level of Greek capitalist development and the organization of the labor movement, as well as with the political and ideological class struggle that was taking place in those circumstances. Unlike in other advanced countries, Greek Marxism was to a large extent formed and transmitted in underground conditions, and more specifically in prisons, places of exile, and concentration camps. A truly dogmatic and oversimplified Marxism based on the eclectic reading of text was circulated and reproduced among the militants and used as a theoretical tool for political and social struggles. Economism, determinism, and many aspects of the mechanistic and instrumental materialism that characterized the theory and practice of the Greek communist movement derived from that period. In a repressive context of censorship and punishment of Marxist and leftist ideas, the Leninist and Soviet version of Marxism was the dominant one. Yet the political and ideological dominance of the Communist Party in the domain of the Greek left did not mean that the other leftist groups had no theoretical and publishing activity. The most significant contribution to these political groups made was the transmission of Marxist ideas to Greece during the interwar period. Both the minor socialist and Trotskyist groups sought to make the Greek people familiar with an alternative Marxist literature and aspects of Marxism that were opposed to the dominant Stalinist policy and ideology of the Greek Communist Party. Nevertheless, their political and theoretical elaborations remained within the boundaries of the orthodox Marxism of Trotskyism or of the Second International. According to Castoriadis' personal testimony, quote, under the Metaxas dictatorship, all left-wing books were burnt, and then there was the occupation. So one was not really in touch with the literature. Still, in 1942-43 in Greece, I had the good luck to find copies of Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed, Victor Serge, Siliga's book, and Boris Suvarin's Stalin, end quote. Siliga's book was it's called the Russian Enigma. Castoriadis did not make clear in which language he read the above books, but there is little doubt that he did so in French or in English, since there was no Greek translations of these books at that time except for Trotsky's Revolution Betrayed. At any rate, the number of translations of Marxist texts that Castoriadis had available before 1945 was limited. The first translations of works relating to, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, appeared at the beginning of the 1920s. They were mostly translations that were aiming to popularize socialist theory, transmitting the ideas of Marxism, Leninism, and educating the cadres. When I say Marxism and Leninism, it's not Marxism, Leninism like the ideology, but Marxism, Leninism. Okay, so they were mostly translations that were aiming to popularize socialist theory, transmitting the ideas of Marxism, Leninism, and educating the cadres of the labor and trade unionist movement theoretically. In 1911, the Communist Manifesto was published, and in 1921, a summary of Capital by Paul Lafargue, and both Wage, Labor, and Capital, and Wages, Price, and Profit. The contribution to the critique of political economy was published in 1927, followed by Volume 1 and the first six chapters of Volume 2 of Capital in 1927 to 1928, and Value, Price, and Profit in 1928. In a parallel way, the journal, something in Greek, it's translated as the Marxist Archive, started to publish Marxist works in order to instruct the workers and improve the intellectual level of the communists. For this reason, in its first volume in 1923, it published Lenin's State and Revolution and Imperialism, Varga's Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Kautsky's Erfurt Program, and Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program. In its second volume in 1924-25, it published Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, and Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, Engels' Anti-Düring and Marx's The Civil War in France and the Poverty of Philosophy. Finally, in its third volume, it published, among others, Lenin's What is to be Done, Bogdanov's Short Course of Economic Science, and Trotsky's Europe and America, and Where is Russia Going? In addition, the following were available: Marx's On the Jewish Question in 1933, Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, 1920, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, 1920, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of German Classical Philosophy in 1927, Bukharin's Lenin as Marxist in 1927, Trotsky's Terrorism and Communism, 1921, Kollontais' Sexual Relations and the Class Struggle, 1933, Kautsky's Economic Doctrines of Marx, 1927, and Ethics and Materialist Conception of History in 1923, Zombart's The Proletariat in 1921, The Future of Capitalism, 1933, and Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, 1945. These translations were made under particularly difficult circumstances due to the persecutions against the labor and communist movements. As a result, the vast majority of the Marxist translations were done to a low standard, and many of them remain unfinished. Another barrier to these translations was related to the fact that the Greek language was lacking the appropriate, quote, scientific terminology, end quote, notably in economics. Unlike other countries, such as Italy, the lack of translations acted as a brake on the creation of a, quote, Greek school of Marxist thought, end quote. The orthodox Marxist literature was predominant, and significant texts by Marx were lacking. There was also a notable absence of other important Marxist writers such as Luxemburg, Korsch and Gramsci, and Lukács. The issue of the available Marxist literature during the interwar period in Greece is a matter of great importance in order to trace Castoriadis' initial intellectual roots. It indicates the version of Marxism with which Castoriadis became familiar. Therefore, it can be noted that in his formative years in Greece, Castoriadis obtained a very strong taste of orthodox Marxism in both theory and practice. Alongside his political participation, Castoriadis joined the philosophical circles of his times, taking part in the discussions organized by a group called Archive of Philosophy, which consisted of mainly conservative but highly educated intellectuals. At the same time, he graduated from the 8th Male Gymnasium of Athens and enrolled in the Faculty of Law in Athens on the 15th of November 1937. He obtained a BA in Political Sciences on the 19th of February 1942 and a BA in Law on the 27th of March 1942. According to his student file, his grades and results of his final exams, Castoriadis was an exceptional student, graduating from the university with a distinction of 8 9.5 equal to 9. 8 and 9/12 equal to 9. His attendance on specific courses and modules indicates some of his initial inclinations and preferences and the likely impact of the department's professors on his later intellectual trajectory. From his file, it appears that apart from the law modules, Castoriadis did extremely well and passed with a distinction the modules in economics. It is worth mentioning here that the Faculty of Law in Athens was the first department in Greece and the only one by 1921 where the module Political and Public Economy was taught. In the period when Castoriadis studied in the department, the module was run by Professor Aggelos Aggelopoulos. He was an economist who dreamed of universal economic collaboration, a convergence of the economic systems, and who believed in a combination of planned economy with respect to basic individual rights and liberties. Moreover, he maintained that, quote, the socialist idea is not restricted to Marxism, end quote. One thing that is of interest here is that Marxist thought and Marxism were almost excluded from the Greek academic mainstream. The vast majority of the progressive professors were socialists or social democrats who kept a distance from more radical and revolutionary aspects of Marxism. Others who taught in the same department, for instance, Varvaresos, sought a new social and economic system beyond capitalism and socialism, and Zolotas argued that the collapse of capitalism constituted a moral demand of the people. Finally, Satsos argued for a, quote, non-dogmatic socialism, end quote, and advised his students to be skeptical of leftist propaganda about the inevitable collapse of capitalism. All of these theoretical positions seem to have influenced Castoriadis' thought in the sense that they strengthened his objections to the validity of Marxism-Leninism, the codification of socialist theory, the Marxist deterministic interpretation of history, and the inevitable collapse of capitalism. These influences, along with the codified and mechanistic Marxism of the Greek Communist Party, combined with its harsh and opportunist Stalinist practices, continued even in France to be a point of reference in the eyes of the Greek intellectual. As the first 20 years of his intellectual itinerary demonstrate, the generic intellectual and political atmosphere in Greece had a very strong influence upon Castoriadis' later theoretical elaborations. Located within this context, the peculiarity of his migration could make more sense and shed light on the formative experiences and the early influences of the young Greek intellectual. Section 1.3, the peculiarity of Castoriadis' migration. The post-liberation period in Greece did not amount to a new phase of peace, social stability, and economic development. There was no room for rapid and structural transformations and reformations, because for Greece, the end of the Second World War signaled a new period of crises and conflicts, and the first phase of the events which led up to the outbreak of the Greek Civil War from 1946 to 1949. The British imperialist intervention, in collaboration with the provocations of the Greek right-wing establishment, led to the armed conflict of December 1944, the so-called Decembriana. On the 3rd of December 1944, the Greek police opened fire on a mass demonstration organized by the leftist movement, killing more than 28 people and injuring 148. Over a month's fighting was set off between the forces of the Greek leftist fighters and those of the Greek government and the British army, in which the Greek leftist movement was defeated militarily. The peace agreement, Varkiza Agreement, on the 12th of February 1945, which was signed between the Greek right-wing government and the National Liberation Front, National People's Army, EAM/ELAS, indicated that the, quote, balance of power in Greece as a whole, had, end bracket, swung suddenly and decisively against the left for the first time since 1942, end quote. The Varkiza Agreement was aimed at finishing the December 1944 military conflict and at reconciling the conflicting political and social sections, leading the country to socio-political stability and economic growth. Contrary to its alleged aims and declarations, however, Greek society remained divided and polarized. The agreement was followed by a period of uncontrolled violence, and atrocities were committed against the Greek leftist movement and the civilian population. right-wing violence and purges marked the beginning of the, quote, white terror, end quote, period from 1945 to 1946. Leftists and Democrats paid a heavy price during these purges. Leftist newspapers were banned, leftist organizations were destroyed, and their members were prosecuted, jailed, and murdered. As Voglis has noted, quote, within 1 year of the Varkiza agreement, according to EAM sources, the results of the, quote, white terror, end quote, were 1,192 people killed, 159 women raped, 6,413 people injured, and 551 offices and printing shops raided, end quote. Unlike in other European countries, in Greece, purges took place in the civil service, not against the Nazi collaborators, but rather against leftists and members of the Greek resistance. In this context, the ideological dominance of the right was the corollary of its political and military victory. The Greek government not only abolished basic civil liberties by suppressing the freedom of speech and by intervening in the trade unions in favor of right-wing trade unions, but also attempted to control and manipulate all of the ideological and educational institutions. The situation in higher education could be characterized in many ways as tragic, bleak, and desperate. Purges took place in the universities, and many university professors were prosecuted and fired because of their participation in the Greek resistance. This reign of terror in the universities was combined with a general intellectual, scientific, and cultural regression. Tsoukalos has very vividly described the situation in Greek universities, and mainly in the area of the social sciences. Quote, in higher education, the situation was even worse, at least in the humanities and in the social sciences. Sociology was by definition suspect. Political science remained marginal. All, quote, new, end quote, and potentially critical branches were absent, whether as a result of deliberate intent or possibly of simple ignorance. The study of psychology was rudimentary at best. Predictably, psychoanalysis was not even mentioned as a possible discipline. Contemporary history was conspicuously absent from the curricula, while economic and cultural history were generally relegated to the background, end quote. The state of Greek society as a whole after the Second World War was very critical. It was characterized by violence and terror against a large percentage of the population. There was neither peace nor security, and the social and economic conditions were chaotic. Under these circumstances, survival was the citizens' only concern. The Greek people felt threatened at any time and consequently looked to escape from a situation that was oppressive and dangerous for their lives. During the Nazi occupation of Greece, George Theotokos, a distinguished liberal intellectual, eloquently expressed how desperate the situation was. Quote, last winter, our journey into hell, I dared not write about what I saw. It was too burdensome and painful. Bracket, those who are not there, end bracket, will have the urge to relive it, perhaps indeed to discern in the midst of the horror the magic of great historical moments. All we ask is never to see such things again, to flee from them, to flee, but in what direction? End quote. George Theotokos. 2 years later, in 1945, and despite Greece's liberation from the Nazis, the above agonized question remained unsolved and equally urgent. People wanted to flee, but how and in what direction? The less privileged citizens fled to the mountains, and according to Woodhouse, they numbered around 20,000. On the other hand, For some young Greeks, life was more generous. Approximately 220 young Greek intellectuals fled to France thanks to a scholarship provided to them by the French government. The first group, which included 123 Greek students, on the 22nd of December 1945, traveled in a ship called Mataroa from Piraeus to Tarantus, and then via Bologna and Basel, arrived in Paris by train on the 28th of December, 1945. Octave Merlier and Roger Milieu, I don't know if I'm saying that right, it's probably Milieu. The two directors of the French Institute at Athens contributed decisively In order for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to award scholarships to a surprisingly large number of young Greeks to move to France and study there. There were approximately 800 candidates for the scholarship, and the process of selection appeared to be very difficult. The majority of these young intellectuals belonged to the category that Laura Fermi has described as, quote, not fully educated adults, who were too young at the time to hold the equivalent of a college degree, but had been molded to a great extent by the cultural forces of their country of origin, end quote. A large proportion of the recipients were leftist members of the Greek Communist Party and had taken an active part in the Greek resistance, and some of them had already been persecuted by the right-wing Greek government. According to later tragic political developments and the outbreak of the Greek Civil War, their migration to France could be considered as the last and simultaneously the best resort in order to survive and keep themselves alive. The exodus could be seen as the last episode of the intellectual migration that took place in Europe after the Nazi seizure of power in Germany. Some of the future most significant Greek intellectuals left Greece for good, inter alia Cornelius Castoriadis, who was in good company during the days spent traveling with Costas Axelos, 1924 to 2010, and Costas Papaiano. Oh my god. Sorry. Gotta look this up again, because I'm going to have to keep pronouncing this guy's name.
Κώστας Παπαϊωάννου. Κώστας Παπαϊωάννου.
Papaiano. Kostas Papaiano, with whom he had not only personal but also theoretical affinities. The experience of migration had a considerable impact upon Castoriadis and constituted a fundamental feature of his formative experience. It also had an important and lasting influence on his theoretical development. In this sense, there are several points of similarity between the case of Castoriadis and the migrants of the Frankfurt School and the critical theorists. As Kellner reminds us, quote, critical theory, like much modern philosophy and contemporary social theory, is exile theory, the product of thinkers forced by adverse circumstances into emigration, end quote. Douglas Kellner. As with the critical theorists, so for Castoriadis, his social and political theory is, quote, exile theory, end quote, strongly influenced by the experience of migration. Kistler argued that, quote, the most productive times for revolutionary philosophy had always been the time of exile, end quote. Nonetheless, the experience of migration and its influence upon intellectuals' evolution is very often underemphasized in the literature that is concerned with critical theory. For Kellner, the conditions of exile and the situations in which the intellectual migrants find themselves, quote, can be conducive to producing critical and original thought and writing. For the political emigrant is often fueled by a passion to criticize and unburden himself or herself of anger and frustration. Consequently, the thought and writings of political refugees often contain a sharp critical edge and a polemical passion and intensity, end quote. Likewise, one could ascribe to the experience of migration the polemical passion and intensity, end quote, the quote, polemical passion and intensity, end quote, as well as the sharp critique developed by Castoriadis against orthodox Marxism, the USSR, and Marx's own thought. The existential experience of migration and the hard times in Greece not only rendered him, quote, fueled by a passion to criticize and unburden himself of anger and frustration, end quote, but also made him able to look at the social and political issues from a different angle and develop, quote, original and often striking ideas and perceptions, end quote. The critical theorists' experience and writings, in particular those of Adorno, are indicative of how, quote, exile influenced their choice of language, modes of expression, and development of their social theory, end quote. The same applies to Castoriadis. He was not allowed to visit Greece until 1956, 11 years after his migration. He also had great difficulty in taking French citizenship, and he was only granted full French citizenship in 1970. It was no coincidence, therefore, that until the 1970s, Castoriadis published his political articles under pseudonyms for fear of endangering his émigré status in France. End quote. His theoretical and political familiarity with the orthodox Marxism of the Greek communist movement, along with the existentialist experience of his migration run through his critical theorizing. They shaped his intellectual distinctiveness and were reflected in his later theoretical contribution. Arriving in France, Castoriadis met a world with freedom of thought and favorable conditions to be productive and creative. Arriving in France, Castoriadis met a world with freedom of thought and favorable conditions to be productive and creative. Castoriadis found all of these social and educational conditions that enabled him to contribute decisively to the flourishing and enrichment of post-war continental critical thought. Section 1.4. Castoriadis in France. After the end of the Second World War, France became the ideal destination for the dissident intellectuals of Europe, especially for those who came from authoritarian or fascist regimes and who had been deprived of basic civil liberties and rights for years. The collapse of 1940 and the role that the resistance movement played during the Second World War as a result, the discrediting of, quote, liberal bourgeois intellectual and political traditions, leaving the nation in a conceptual vacuum, end quote. During the post-liberation period, this theoretical void was filled with theoretical debates regarding social transformation and the issue of communism. Although Catholics and Gaullists participated in the resistance, it was obvious that the leftist movement, and in particular socialist and communist intellectuals, had gained in prestige. To a considerable degree, the intellectual atmosphere in post-war France was influenced by the social and political circumstances and was significantly determined by Communist Party policy and the issues addressed by it with respect to domestic and foreign problems. The Communist Party reached the peak of its influence and won 5 million votes in 1945, and by 1947 it consisted of 900,000 members. However, its own political presence was marked by a distinctive authoritarianism, over-centralism, blind obedience to the party line, and party patriotism coupled with a strong nationalist flavor and a personality cult related to its Secretary General, Maurice Thorez. All elements that are consistent with its Stalinist theoretical and organizational characteristics. Its patriotic role was reassured through its participation in government from 1944 to 1947. In general, the party managed to capitalize on its own role in the resistance and the fact that it was seen by the new generations as being the only French political power that symbolized the heroic and glorious victory of the USSR against Nazi Germany. Above all, it exercised a very considerable impact on French intellectuals, notably the young ones who seemed to ignore the past, namely the, quote, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, end quote, or, quote, the troubling Soviet domestic record of the 30s, end quote, saw in the party a political movement responding to their own desire for progress, change, and upheaval, end quote. This link between the Communist Party, the glorification of the Soviet Union, and the intellectuals led to another French peculiarity. A critical attitude towards the USSR could easily be rejected, marginalized, and designated as reactionary and counter-revolutionary. According to Kilnani, quote, contrary to the situation in Britain, where the much more immediately and differently felt effects of writers like Küstler and Orwell made it perfectly reasonable, if by no means mandatory, to reject the Soviet Union as a political model, and yet continue to remain on the left. In France, it was not until the 1970s that such a position became intellectually and politically sustainable, end quote. Kilnani. The 15 years between 1945 and 1960 proved that France was able to find a new social and political stability which led to rapid and successful industrial transformation. French communist intellectuals, however, insisted on ignoring profound social and economic changes. whereas critical theory in other advanced Western countries made an effort to analyze the new developments of capitalism, French communist intellectuals remained anchored in their traditional Soviet-type Marxist interpretations of the world. Despite the dogmatism and entrenchment of the communist intellectuals, however, new social and economic characteristics emerged in post-war France, and this modernization influenced the theoretical debates and ideological currents. According to Poster, it was a period of, quote, profound reorientation and vitality in social theory, end quote, which influenced both Marxist and non-Marxist intellectuals. Additionally, the shifts in post-war theoretical debates were decisively determined by the pre-war intellectual tradition and atmosphere. The social and political conditions in France did not favor the flourishing of Marxism. The acceptance of Marxism in France was belated, and one of the main reasons for this slow emergence of Marxism was that, quote, the intellectual competitors of Marxism, Blanqui's Jacobinism and Proudhon's syndicalism, dominated the French workers' movement well into the 20th century, end quote. For Duvignon, a resistance to Marxism was put up, quote, by the, quote, intellectual class, end quote, that had been nourished for more than a century on liberal ideas and then upon the utopianisms of the 48, end quote. Admittedly, quote, the centralized and strongly bureaucratic university system, end quote, was, quote, the hard core of this resistance, end quote, since it had a dogmatic attitude towards excluding radical and subversive philosophical ideas, and as a consequence, the, quote, invasions of the great ideas, while they were spreading widely in Central Europe, were repulsed in France by the chauvinism and traditionalism of official bodies right up to the last war, end quote. A turning point for the spread of Marx's ideas in France was the, quote, discovery, end quote, of Hegel's world and his assimilation by French intellectuals and academics after the Second World War. The experience of the war facilitated the Hegel Renaissance, as the Hegelian conceptual tools and insights appeared to supply a much more profound comprehension of the unfolding events and the most poignant aspects of this unique historical conjuncture. It also challenged and discredited the past philosophical strands that drew heavily on, quote, analytical rationalism, end quote, by shifting the debates on key Hegelian ideas such as the concept of alienation and the dialectic. Interest in Hegel and his importance to the French intellectuals was evidenced in the titles of the DEA, dissertations written between 1947 and 1949 by three later leading intellectual figures of French culture, Louis Althusser, Jacques Maritain, and Michel Foucault. And there's like three titles for each of these thinkers that has something to do with Hegel. This rebirth of interest in Hegel, and especially in his phenomenology of spirit, was not the only impact of the German philosophical tradition on the post-war French intellectual atmosphere. In general, the French intellectual landscape was dominated by, quote, German philosophy's three H's, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, end quote. In this context, the philosophy of Hegel and its radical interpretation supplied by Kojève and Hippolyte facilitated the study of Marx's early writings and generated a genuine interest in his own theorizing. It should be noted here that, with the exception of his political and historical writings and his Capital, which appeared in French during the 19th century, the whole body of Marx's writing was translated into French mainly between 1927 and 1967. As Mark Poster has stressed, quote, the Molitor translations began in 1927 with Marx's doctoral dissertation in the Holy Family, the German ideology, and the all-important Paris manuscripts of 1844, known in France as Économie, Politique et Philosophie, did not appear until 1937, and even then it was ignored until after the Liberation. The critique of Hegel's philosophy of right appeared a little earlier in 1935, but the Grundrisse, which showed the continuity of Marx's thought from the 1844 manuscripts to Capital, was not published in French until 1967. End quote. Mark Poster. Such a belated introduction and translation of Marx's writings in France in the absence of basic Marxian text had a double impact. First, Marx's thought could not be studied rigorously and properly until the close of the Second World War, and second, the fact that Marx's texts were delayed in coming to France could explain the, quote, slow development of an open Marxism in France, end quote. The translation and publication of Marx's early writings gave the impression that the rediscovery of another Marx was possible, and concepts such as alienation and praxis came to the fore. The central issue at stake was that of the, quote, 1844 manuscripts, end quote, and the idea of alienation were able to offer a new basis for a new reading and interpretation of Marx. The newly discovered, quote, young Marx, end quote, who dealt with, quote, man, end quote, and not with means and forces of production or economics, became the center of the debate that occupied Marxist thinkers. In this context, new and radical readings of Marx were formulated in a parallel way with the increasing interest in Marx's thought itself. According to Richtheim, quote, Marxism and revisionism spread simultaneously, the former in the academic world, the latter among Marxists, end quote. This development of Marxism in post-war France was also fostered by the foreign intellectuals and refugees who were in exile, and due to their political experiences, they strongly questioned Marx's use by both the Russian regime and European social democracy. This current of the foreign intellectuals who fled to France after the end of the Second World War included Cornelius Castoriadis. Arriving in France at the end of 1945, the young Greek intellectual had to deal with the orthodoxy of the French Communist Party and the ideological power that it exercised over French political and intellectual developments. From this point of view, one could conceive of how difficult and pioneering Castoriadis' attempts to criticize the Soviet system and orthodox Marxism were. He embarked on his critique from a radical point of view and was automatically pushed by the Stalinist intellectuals and the French Communist Party to the margins of intellectual debate. As Kilnani has argued, quote, after the defeat of fascism in an atmosphere thick with accusations of collaboration and betrayal, anti-fascism was most easily displayed by support for the Soviet Union. In this context, the anti-Soviet and revolutionary critique made by those such as Castoriadis and Lafleur could not gain much force, end quote. On the other hand, the Greek scholar was deeply influenced by the intellectual currents that characterized post-war France. The rediscovery of Hegel, the renewed interest in Marx, the focus on his early writings and the impact of German philosophy constituted a new and unique experience for the young Greek at a time when he was forming the core of his theoretical positions. It was a period of intense intellectual ferment, and he was actively involved in it. The relationship between Marx and philosophy, or the issue about the philosophical foundations of Marxist thinking, was the subject of a long-standing controversy and gave rise to several interpretations of Marx's work and at times to opposing Marxist tendencies. Critical Marxist thinkers reopened the old questions posed by Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, and the philosophical content of Marxism was located at the epicenter of the theoretical discussions. The Greek scholar made his contribution to these debates within an intellectual atmosphere that was marked by the emergence and interrelation of a variety of scholarly currents, such as Hegelian Marxism, Heideggerian Marxism, Freudo-Marxism, phenomenological Marxism, and existentialism. The influence of Lukács, Korsch, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty's reading of Marx, as well as the Hegel Renaissance, expressed principally by Jean Hippolyte and Alexandre Kojève, should be considered in order to comprehend Castoriadis' milieu in France. Let's see how we pronounce some of these things. One second.
Alexandre Kojève. Alexandre Kojève.
Alexander Kojève. All right, got it right. Where am I? Castoriadis continued his studies in France and made an effort to pursue a PhD thesis in philosophy, but he never managed to complete it. Having Hegel in mind, the subject of his thesis was that, quote, any attempt at a rationally constructed philosophical system leads to blind alleys, to aporias, and to antinomies, end quote. In continuity with his Greek political experience, Castoriadis' new life in France was associated from the outset with political activities. He joined the French section of the Fourth International, the International Communist Party, and later on, his meeting with Claude Lefort led to the formation of a minority group within the party. Lefort vividly recalled his first meeting with Castoriadis. Quote, I first heard him lecture to the party on the USSR in preparation for the Third Congress. His analysis overwhelmed me. I was convinced by him before he even reached his conclusion. I would have never been able to articulate the economic foundation that he provided for his conclusion. Castoriadis' arguments seemed to me worthy of the best marks, but the Trotskyists deemed them heresy, end quote. In the summer of 1948, Lefort and Castoriadis left the PCI, the International Communist Party, criticizing the Trotskyist explanation of Stalinism, and later on they, quote, formed an independent group and published the first issue of Socialisme ou Barbarie in March 1949, end quote. Castoriadis wrote using pseudonyms such as Paul Cardin, Pierre Chelieu, Jean Delvaux, and Jean-Marc Coudray. As a group, Socialisme ou Barbarie had a, quote, very limited appeal, end quote, and Castoriadis very eloquently described this marginalization. Quote, we were absolutely isolated. There was a period when, after the outbreak of the Korean War, we were less than a dozen in the group, and the audience was extremely limited, residual ultra-leftist groups, end quote. Later on, the situation started to change, and the political events and changes that took place after the death of Stalin gave a new vigor to Socialisme ou Barbarie. In Castoriadis' words, quote, after 1953, with Stalin dead, the Berlin Revolt, the Czechoslovakian strikes in 1954, then Hungary and Poland in 1956, the atmosphere started changing and the review gained some audience never very important. At the time, we were selling about 1,000 copies of the magazine, which were read around. Then came the Algerian War and the stand we took against the Algerian War. There was a kind of renaissance amongst the student youth at that time. People started coming and the group grew. Sometime in 1958/1959, the whole of France, including the provinces, were about 100. By 62, 63, 64, we could hold public meetings in Paris with, say, 300 or 400 people, but all of this, as you see, was extremely limited, end quote. Could you imagine having 300 people come to your public meeting and it being considered extremely limited? Dude, if I get 5 people in a room to talk about something worthwhile, it's a great achievement. Anyway, yet despite the isolation of a group, according to Hirsch, the journal, quote, proved significant as the only vehicle for a systematic gauchiste critique of the communist movement during the height of the Cold War, while many leftist intellectuals, with Sartre in the lead, buried their qualms and sided with the Soviet Union against the capitalist West. Socialisme ou Barbarie continued a critique of both sides, end quote. The group, Socialisme ou Barbarie, developed close relationships with the Johnson-Forrest tendency, CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya, in the USA, in the British group and journal Solidarity, Maurice Brinton. Some 40 issues of the journal were published before 1965, when the cessation of publication was announced and the group ceased to exist in 1967. During this period, the Castoriadis' thought developed from a critique of orthodox Marxism to one of Marxist thought itself. From 1971 to 1975, he served on the editorial board of the review Textures, and from 1976 to 1980 of the journal Libre, while in 1970 he started to study and practice psychoanalysis. He worked as a professional economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development from 1948 to 1970, and later on as a psychoanalyst. He conducted a weekly seminar at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales from 1980 to 1995. Not surprisingly, Castoriadis was characterized as a, quote, prolific essayist, end quote, since, with the exception of the Imaginary Institution of Society, published in 1975, Castoriadis' books are basically collections of essays, interviews, and seminars. Quote, man is his visions, end quote. As Octavio Paz put it, needless to add that we are our influences and the experiences that we have been through as well. Equally, one could claim that the concrete historical circumstances, the socio-political background, and the intellectual milieu influence Castoriadis' theoretical position. The formation of his thought has to be understood as a process of interaction with the socio-historical reality and as a result of the experiences that he went through. His early years in Greece, the existential experience of the migration, and the intellectual milieu in France decisively formed his intellectual idiosyncrasy and were reflected in his later theoretical contribution. More specifically, the nature of his intellectual migration and his life experiences found expression in the particular ways in which he attempted to interpret and criticize Marxism and Marx's own thought. However, before criticizing Marx, he started by defending Marx's original thought from its misuses and distortions. By criticizing Trotsky's ideas, contrasting them with those of Marx, he made a remarkable effort to demystify the actual class character of the USSR. His intellectual endeavor led him to question Lenin and Leninism and to explicate the crisis and decay of Marxism. He also sought to identify Marx's responsibility for this metamorphosis of orthodox Marxism and its reactionary function. Let's now trace his trajectory and theoretical itinerary from a critique of bureaucracy in Marxism to a critique of Marx. End of chapter 1. Come on, man.